Good morning, YouTube. Welcome to the Reptile Barn, and welcome to our second Monday morning conservation topic. The first one went over really well, where we talked about the blue tree monitors. So today, we are going to do this talk about eastern indigos. Okay, so I have here for you a gorgeous yearling female eastern indigo. She's a nice red throat. So you can maybe see if she'll hold still at all, which she won't. That's okay. We have 4 of these. They're all captive bred, of course, as you'll see shortly. They have to be. And we have from 2 different breeders, and from each of those breeders, 2 different lines. So this is as diverse a group as we could come up with. My hair's doing something funky. That's okay. For the small size of our collection, we're only going to have 4. We got as diverse genetic, as much genetic diversity, I guess a better way to put that, as we possibly could. So, I want to talk though about the conservation efforts regarding this species. Okay, so this is in the genus Drymarchon. So the indigos and the crebos, they look very similar to a Texas indigo, but the Texas indigos, their black color seems to have more of maybe a brown to it, and then the eastern indigos have more of a blue hue to their black scales. So, but very similar looking snakes. The easterns are the ones that are listed, federally speaking, as a threatened species. Okay. Now, rather than talking about the legal side of things, I want to talk about the conservation concerns and response, okay? Because this is a fascinating story, and I'm only really going to give you the basics, because it's a lot, right? These are pretty famous as far as snakes go. They're from the southeastern United States, especially Florida, but they're native to Alabama, Georgia, and decades ago, it was becoming pretty clear that their numbers were going down, right? And because they're a really large and iconic species, they got more attention than a typical snake species might, okay? They're known to eat a lot of venomous snakes, for example. They're the longest snake native to the United States. They are just really cool looking. They don't act scared like a lot of snakes do, especially big adults. People can just see them basking on a rock, and as long as they don't touch it, it'll just keep basking on the rock sometimes. They don't always, scamper off and hide like a lot of snakes would. Very confident, powerful hunters. So people like them. As far as liking snakes goes in the general population. So when it was kind of clear that they were diminishing in the wild, there was a lot of concern. A lot of studies were done. And it was quickly discovered that in the southernmost part of their range, in southern Florida, they were still doing very well. Everywhere else, they were going downhill pretty quickly. They ended up realizing there's this. This is really cool, guys. So I'll try and make this as concise as possible, but there's a lot that goes on with this story. They obviously, being a snake, road and car collision mortality is always going to be a concern. Habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. A lot of the major culprits were certainly at play. However, South Florida has a huge human population, and they were still doing decently well there. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense. If those were the main issues, why were they doing so much better in one part of their range than they were everywhere else? Well, I'm going to fast forward through the research they did, but it turns out that southern Florida is the only part of their range warm enough that they never really have to get out of the cold. Okay? Uh, Everywhere else, at least once or twice a winter, if not more, they need to be able to get out of the cold when it happens. They are not going to brumate like a lot of pretty much tons at most. I don't want to say all the others, but the vast majority of snakes native to the U.S. brumate. These guys don't. While they love tunnels, they don't really dig their own tunnels. So they are very, very reliant on the burrows dug by gopher tortoises. Gopher tortoises are fantastic diggers. Okay. And so when the temperature starts dropping in Georgia or Alabama or northern Florida, they will seek out a gopher tortoise burrow, which go really deep. Okay, gopher tortoises will burrow at a steep angle, like sometimes 6 or 8 feet down, and then a little chamber at the end. And these guys would go down there, whether there was a gopher tortoise in there or not. And the ambient heat from the earth keeps it a little warmer down there. They could wait out that cold night or even a cold week, and then come back out, right? Well, they realized that the gopher tortoises were diminishing. And the gopher tortoises ended up becoming a real kind of keystone species to this whole ecosystem because so many other species, it turned out, were also reliant on those really excellent gopher tortoise burrows. Okay? So the effort to figure out what's going wrong with eastern indigos has morphed into what's going wrong with the gopher tortoises, realizing that that's going to be able to help a whole bunch of other species if we can figure this out. So they're like, well, why are the gopher tortoises not thriving? Again, fast forwarding through all the research they had to do and data collection and field studies, they realized that gopher tortoises need a very specific type of habitat. Okay? And they can't climb trees to get their food. They relied on, so like longleaf pine forests, for example, types of forest that the canopy wasn't super dense, so a lot of sunlight still hits the ground, allowing a lot of vegetation and forbs and things to grow. That's what the gopher tortoises want to eat, right? If the canopy gets too dense, sunlight isn't really hitting the forest floor very much, and there's minimal vegetation, and the gopher tortoises are struggling. Okay? So they were like, well, why are our forests changing? That doesn't make any sense. What's going on with that? Why would something that's clearly been here for thousands of years, an ecosystem, be changing all of a sudden? Well, as many issues in conservation, it turns out it was humans' fault. But also, like many of these issues, it wasn't really on purpose, okay? It wasn't just, big, evil, industrial Americans ruining nature. It wasn't done on purpose at all. The population growth of humans and more of these ecosystems being places with roads, places with towns, buildings, houses, farms, whatever, meant that the states were suppressing fire to a large degree, naturally occurring wildfires. And they just didn't want people's houses to burn down. That's not a bad motivation at all. But the forest types that the gopher tortoises rely on were very, very resistant to fire, but not super competitive with some of the other tree species. So if you start to remove the fires, those trees that are not super resistant to the fire, but very competitive with other trees, are going to start to take over. And those trees tended to have a much thicker canopy. Okay, so you with me so far? It's like a mystery novel almost, where each step leads to a new discovery, and they finally realize that, again, we're simplifying here for the sake of a short vlog, but this particular issue was a major problem. And they needed some forest restoration work. So they needed to start allowing maybe some controlled burns so that the resistant types of trees, like the longleaf pine, would be able to outcompete some of the encroaching tree types. They were able to slowly, over time, start to take specific places. I know they used a national forest in Alabama. I want to say Conecuh National Forest. Don't quote me on that. But and somewhere in Georgia, and then also in northern Florida, or maybe in the panhandle of Florida, and they started building. I say building, altering the ecosystem back towards its more natural state. And when gopher tortoises started to rebound, they used those locations to start reintroducing eastern indigos. Now, this was a huge endeavor. Multiple state agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and some nonprofits, specifically the Orion Society, were able to breed eastern indigos and release them. But here's another really important concept with that kind of thing. Most of the time, when reptile keepers and breeders are talking about how, oh, we want to have these rare species in our collections just in case they're needed to be reintroduced into the wild later on, most of the time that's not actually very viable. Our animals are not documented in the scientific ways that those types of projects need. Tracing their genetics, for example. And we also are handling our snakes, right? They encounter humans in very unnatural ways. If you have dogs, if you have little kids, if you have other pets, these snakes are desensitized to danger, right? And they make very poor candidates to be released into the wild. What's more, even if you take a snake that you've been very careful not to desensitize, which these groups that I mentioned were very careful about, you can't just take a baby indigo you just hatched and chuck it out into Florida and expect it to survive. It's probably not going to. 99% of the time, it's not going to. You have to set up what they call a soft introduction. So you're going to have an area, a natural area outdoors that you have fenced somehow that does not allow the baby indigos to get out, and it does not allow most predators to get in. But the snake still has to fend for itself, has to find somewhere to sleep, to hide, to bask. It has to hunt its own food. It has to find water. It's just that you're removing a large chunk of the danger, so that as this snake is getting used to taking care of the necessities of life, it's not getting picked off by a hawk. It's not getting killed by a much larger snake. You know what I'm saying? So without this soft introduction, most wildlife reintroductions are very, very, very low probability of success. Even with a soft introduction, when you then move on to your hard introduction, or completely releasing them into the wild, you should still expect a sad amount of mortality, right? But nowhere near what you would get if you just threw them all out into the wild from the get-go. So, to recap, they wanted to figure out what's going wrong with the eastern indigos. They realized that in the northern part of their range, they need to get out of the cold, and the main way they do that is by using gopher tortoise burrows. They realized that gopher tortoises were dwindling from lack of food. They realized the food wasn't growing because the forest type was altering, which was because humans had been suppressing the fires that were allowing the right type of trees to let sunlight through to the forest floor, growing gopher tortoise food. So as they fixed that problem, the results cascaded down to a point where indigos and a bunch of other species that utilize gopher tortoise burrows were able to have a lot more success in the wild. So then they get some conservation groups together and some agencies, and they breed them in pretty large numbers, very careful to not acclimate them to human interaction. And then they have these soft introduction sites, and eventually they release them into the places that they have rehabilitated the ecosystem, okay? To the point where they never needed to list them as endangered. They listed them as threatened, and that pretty much cut off, the pet trade from using wild-caught indigos. It's just completely illegal. So there might be here and there someone poaching them, but as far as the legal trade in large numbers, completely dried up when they listed them as threatened. But their conservation process was so successful that they don't need to list them as endangered. And someday, when their numbers have rebounded enough, they will be able to probably delist them entirely, which is just awesome. I love that, especially in a really high populated state like Florida, where you would think we're never going to get rid of these human caused problems enough because the human numbers are only going up. Our impact is only going up, but that's not always true. Sometimes we are able to figure out the specific things we're doing wrong to the ecosystem and fix it. Not always. And the will isn't always there either. You know, sometimes we might have a solution, but if they're like, oh, that's going to cost you $1 billion, it doesn't always happen, right? But in this case, I am confident saying that it's a success story. Not a completed success story, but on the right track. And a whole lot of science had to go into this. A lot of data collection, a lot of biologists spending long days in the field, figuring all this out. And they did it. So does that solve, road mortality? No. Does it solve habitat fragmentation, pollution, all those sorts of things? No. Those are separate issues. Those need to be addressed. But usually a native species is fairly resilient. They evolved for that location. So 1 or 2 or 3 even disturbances, problems, pressures that are difficult for them to survive, they often can resist and still thrive. But they reach a critical mass where you're piling, maybe a disease, the pet trade, taking too many from the wild, collisions with cars, all these issues start to pile up and they just cannot adapt fast enough. They can't thrive in the face of so many issues at once, right? But if you can find some of the biggest problems and remove those, often, not always, again, but often, life is resilient. So all of these Eastern indigos in my collection and anyone else's collection are captive bred. They are very well documented. You have to get a permit because they are listed as threatened. Basically just proving that they really are captive bred, right? It's not super difficult to get. It's a bit of paperwork, takes some time, but I think that's well worth it to be able to keep this fantastic species and to prove that I'm not doing something that's going to harm them in the wild, right? They're wild populations. So that is the short version of the conservation story behind this incredible species, the Eastern indigo snake. These get very large, by the way. I'm trying to make sure these types of videos that I'm releasing are conservation based, but the biology of the actual species being discussed is really cool. My male is almost 8 feet long, and he's not even, the biggest Eastern indigo out there. So they're a very impressive snake, very confident snake. They're really not biters, although their jaw strength is pretty strong for a snake, and their teeth are pretty big for a non-venomous snake. So a bite would hurt. Luckily, they're not really known for biting. They're pretty great handling snakes, honestly. Anyway, I don't want to get off on tangents. I hope that this was enjoyable. I I get a lot of comments from people from the Southeast when I do indigo videos, giving me new bits of information or just, telling me about a time they saw one in the wild. I love those sorts of things. So please let me know in the comments anything you have to say, any questions. Obviously, if I got something wrong in this story, please do let me know and I can look further into it. But that is the story in a nutshell of the eastern indigo snake. Thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, we are the Reptile Barn.